So you're ignoring a variable. So what you're giving us is you decry, and people decry vaccine hesitancy. It's coming from the gobbledygook that you give us. You're not paying attention to the science. The very basic science is that previous infection provides a level of immunity. If you ignore that in your studies, if you don't present that in your committees, you're not being truthful or honest with us.
Senator.
But she's had the flu for 14 days. Should she get a flu shot?
Well, no. If she got the flu for 14 days, she's as protected as anybody can be, because the best vaccination is to get infected yourself.
And
So
she should not get it?
If she really has the flu, she definitely doesn't need a flu vaccine. If she really has the flu,
She should not get it again.
No, she doesn't need it, because it's the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
This is an ongoing question, and we've had ever-evolving opinions from you, Dr. Fauci. Currently, antibody surveys show that 80% of children, approximately 80% of children, have had COVID, and yet there are no guidelines coming from you or anybody in the government to take into account their naturally acquired immunity. You seemed quite certain of yourself in 2004, but in 2022, there's a lot less certainty. One of the things that we also know after looking at this for 2 to 3 years is that the mortality from COVID is very similar, if not less, than influenza. So when we look at this, we wonder, why you seem to really embrace basic immunology back in 2004 and why you seem to reject it now.
Well, I don't reject basic immunology, Senator, and I have never denied that there is importance of the protection following infection. However, as we have said many times, and as has been validated by the authorization by the FDA through their committee and the recommendation by the CDC through their committee, that a vaccination following infection gives an added extra boost. And that film that you showed is really taken out of context. I believe that was when someone called in who had a reaction to a vaccine and asked me through a telephone in the interview if they should get vaccinated again. So it was in the context of someone who had a reaction. As a matter of fact, Reuters fact check looked at that and said, Fauci's 2004 comments do not contradict his pandemic stance.
Actually, words don't lie. If you look at the words behind me, we can go over them a little bit at a time. She doesn't need it because the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
It is true. It is true, Senator. It is a very potent way to protect.
So when you're trying to tell us that kids need a third or a fourth vaccine, are you including the variability or the variable of previous infection in the studies? No, you're not. Because when you have approved vaccines in recent times, and the committees that have approved it for children don't report anything on hospitalization or death or transmission. They only report that if you give them the jab, they'll make antibodies. And you can give kids hundreds of jabs and they'll make antibodies every time, but that does not prove efficacy. So what you're doing is denying the very fundamental premise of immunology that previous infection does provide some sort of immunity. It's not in any of your studies. Almost none of your studies from the CDC or from the government have the variable of whether or not you've been previously infected. So let's look at adults. I've had 3 infections. Should I get a 4th one? If you're going to measure whether I get a 4th one, you need a category that has a 4th one in it, and you need one that has nothing in it, no vaccine or the 4th vaccine. But you also need to know whether they've been infected. If you ignore whether they've been infected, you're ignoring a vaccine, basically. So you're ignoring a variable. So what you're giving us is you decry, and people decry vaccine hesitancy. It's coming from the gobbledygook that you give us. You're not paying attention to the science. The very basic science is that previous infection provides a level of immunity. If you ignore that in your studies, if you don't present that in your committees, you're not being truthful or honest with us.
Senator, if I might respond, I have never, ever denied fundamental immunology. In fact, I wrote the chapter in the textbook of medicine on fundamental immunology.
Any of the guidelines for vaccines, do any of the guidelines for vaccines from the government include previous infection as something to base your decision-making on with vaccines? Do any of the guidelines involve previous infection? That's why you're ignoring previous infection, because it doesn't involve any of the guidelines. And furthermore, We've been asking you, and you refuse to answer whether anybody on the vaccine committees gets royalties from the pharmaceutical companies. I asked you last time, and what was your response? We don't have to tell you.
Right.
We've demanded them through Freedom of Information Act, and what have you said? We're not going to tell you. But I tell you this, when we get in charge, we're going to change the rules, and you will have to divulge where you get your royalties from what companies, and if anybody on the committee has a conflict of interest, we're going to learn about it. I promise you that.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that, please?
May.
Okay, there are two aspects for what you said. You keep saying you approve, you do this, you do that. The committees that give the approval are FDA through their advisory committee. The committees that recommend are CDC through their advisory committee. And you keep saying, I'm the one that's approving a vaccine based on certain data. So I don't really understand, with all due respect, Senator.
You're the
and I
one
have-
that said you would not reveal what companies
Well,
gave you royalties or what company gave the other scientists royalties.
Gotta move
That's
on.
what you told the committee.
Senator Paul,
Sir,
you gotta move on.
Could I please answer that?
Briefly,
You
yes.
keep asking committees. They're not my committees. They're the VRPAC committee for the FDA and the ACIP for the CDC. So I don't have any idea what goes on.
And they
with
won't
the,
reveal, as well as you won't reveal
Okay,
what
we're gonna
companies
we're
you're
gonna move on. We're over time. Senator Paul, you're over. Everyone's over a little bit. I just want to make sure we keep on time here. For the record, I know Chair Murray and previous chairs of this committee of both parties have found videos to be out of order.
What lingered in the room long after the gavel strained to keep order was that moment. The moment when Senator Rand Paul pressed play on a video of Dr. Anthony Fauci's own words from 2004, letting the past speak directly into the present. The screen flickered with Fauci's younger voice, calm, confident, certain. The best vaccination, he had said then, is to get infected yourself. And as the clip ended, Paul turned toward him with the unmistakable intensity of a man preparing for a political indictment, the weight of 2 decades collapsing into a single confrontation. What followed wasn't just a hearing, it was a collision of eras, of world views, of scientific context and political backlash, all condensed into the space between 2 men who had come to symbolize opposing interpretations of the pandemic years. Paul framed the clip as a contradiction, a crack in the foundation of government messaging, a discrepancy that demanded explanation. He pointed out that today, nearly 80% of children show antibodies, yet no federal guidelines account for naturally acquired immunity. His questions cut like chisels. Why did Fauci once speak so plainly about the power of infection, yet now champion multiple rounds of vaccination? Why, Paul asked, did the certainty of 2004 give way to what he saw as institutional hedging, complexity, and gobbledygook in 2022? And Fauci, who for years had become the face of a nation's scientific struggle, responded with the weariness of someone who has spent a lifetime explaining nuance in a world that rewards sound bites. He insisted he had never denied immunology, never dismissed the protection conferred by infection, but he maintained, carefully, methodically, that vaccination on top of infection offered additional benefit. The clip, he argued, was being torn from its context, plucked out of a very specific conversation with a caller who had suffered a vaccine reaction. Reuters had fact-checked that moment, he said. The science had evolved. The virus had changed. But in hearings like this, nuance often breaks against the rocks of political force. Paul pressed on. He demanded to know why federal guidance failed to include prior infection as a variable in decision-making. Why committees approved vaccines without presenting data on hospitalization, death, or transmission. Why recommendations seemed to him disconnected from the fundamental logic of immunology. His voice sharpened not just with skepticism but with accusation that by ignoring natural immunity, Government agencies had sown confusion, eroded trust, fueled the very hesitancy they sought to combat. And then the confrontation deepened. Paul brought up royalties, payments to scientists, undisclosed relationships he argued the public had a right to see. "When we get in charge," he warned, "you will have to divulge where you get your royalties." It was a threat shaped not by science, but by politics, a promise of coming fights, of oversight battles still looming beyond the hearing room walls. Fauci tried to respond, tried to separate himself from the approval committees that Paul repeatedly implied he controlled. "They're not my committees," he insisted. Again and again he emphasized the architecture of the system, the FDA's advisory panels, the CDC's independent boards. But the senator wasn't interested in bureaucracy. He was interested in accountability, or at least in the appearance of a man holding power to account. Then came the chairman's voice, cutting through the escalating tension. Enough. Time had expired. The hearing had to move on. But even as the microphones cooled, something larger remained suspended over the room. This exchange, tense, sharp, unmistakably charged, captured the broader political moment America is still wrestling with. It revealed the fault line between public health expertise and populist skepticism, between evolving science and the demand for clear, unchanging answers, between authority and distrust. It showed how a nation divided by a virus still struggles to reconcile memory with hindsight, data with narrative, fear with certainty. Because underneath every accusation and every rebuttal lay the question that has haunted the country since the pandemic began. Who do we trust, and why? For some, Fauci is a symbol of steadfast scientific leadership. For others, a symbol of institutional overreach. For some, Paul is a champion of accountability. For others, a provocateur exploiting complexity for political gain. But in that hearing room, none of those narratives mattered as much as what the exchange exposed. A country still reckoning with the cost of confusion, the weight of policy, and the scars left by years of crisis. This moment was not about winning an argument. It was about what it means to live in a democracy where scientific truth, political power, and public trust intersect and collide in full public view. And as the senators shuffled papers, as the witnesses took a breath, as the camera lights dimmed, one truth remained undeniable. Hearings like this are not simply about the past. They are about shaping the future, how we respond to crisis, how we interpret evidence, how we hold leaders accountable without fracturing the very foundations we depend on. If you believe these moments matter, if you want to stay informed, stay aware, stay vigilant, subscribe to the Congress Brief. Support our work to bring clarity to the chaos, to shine light where power meets truth, and to ensure that the American people never lose sight of what happens inside the rooms where decisions are made on their behalf. Because democracy does not survive by accident. It survives because people choose to watch.